Okay, welcome everyone to the first of this year's Science Council British Science Week Lunch and Learn series. Thank you for joining us. My name is Adam Donnan and I'm the Chief Executive of the Institution of Environmental Sciences, one of the member bodies that make up the Science Council. Attendees should add any questions they have for speakers in the Q&A function at the bottom. And you can also use the chat for any general comments that you have, but I won't be looking in there for questions, so try and keep the questions within the Q&A. And we'll be leaving about 15 minutes at the end of the presentations for questions from the audience. Next slide, please, Liz. So firstly, a bit of background on the Science Council, who are hosting today's webinar. The Science Council is an organisation that's close to my own heart, as I served on the Board of Trustees from 2017 to 2024, and I was their chair from 2021 until last September when my term in office ended. The Science Council was founded by a group of scientific professional bodies that came together to gain a royal charter to award chartered scientists across science professional registration. Subsequently, they added more designations, registered scientist and registered science technician. But the organisation is not just a registration authority. It also works to create a diverse and growing science profession that is trusted, respected, innovative, and equipped to meet regional, national, and global challenges. And we'll be talking plenty about global challenges in today's session. Next slide. This slide gives you an idea of the incredible diversity of the Science Council members and the disciplines that they represent. Today we will be talking about how these bodies can work closer together, and the Science Council as an umbrella for these 30 organisations is a great place to do this. Next slide. The Science Council is committed to professional recognition of the diverse range of people working in the myriad of roles across the breadth of scientific disciplines and applications. We believe that by raising standards of practice and encouraging innovation, professional registration benefits the individual, their employer, and society. The Science Council sets the standard for 4 interdisciplinary professional registers, which you can see on the slide there, which recognise workplace competencies and encourage career-long professional development and ethical, sustainable professional practice. Registrants on each of those registers demonstrate commitment and competence and agree to follow a code of professional conduct. We're particularly interested in vocational routes into the science workforce, such as T-levels and apprenticeships, and we are grateful for grants from the Gatsby Charitable Foundation, which help support this work. For an example, in a project that I was proud to chair, we have mapped over 30 apprenticeships to our professional registers, and we're able to offer shortened application routes for professional registration after completing one of those mapped apprenticeships. Next slide. Science Council also works with employers, policymakers and organisations that shape and deliver the education and training landscape for the science workforce, and other organisations that focus on science and the scientific workforce. We pursue high-quality workplace learning to support scientific excellence and innovation and the recruitment and retention of the workforce our nations need. This image on the slide at the moment is the logos of Science Council employee champions, and that represents just a handful of the organisations that we collaborate with. Next slide. This is the first of 4 events that have been run by the Science Council this week as part of British Science Week, and the other events are shown there on the slide. Can I give a personal recommendation for Wednesday's event from Professor Carolyn Roberts, who is also an IS member? I've heard her give similar talks before, and it will be a fascinating exploration of the use of environmental science in solving murders. Very different to the usual scientific talks that a lot of us hear, and I'll also be chairing that one. Next slide. I'm now going to hand over to our 2 speakers. These are 2 of the charismatic megafauna of the environmental field who have both contributed a huge amount to the field and my own organisation, having both been previously chairs of the IES, so effectively my line managers, so I have to say nice things about them. Firstly up will be Gary Cass, who is currently a visiting professor at the Centre for Environment and Sustainability at the University of Surrey. He also does a huge amount for the IES as Vice President, Chair of our External Policy Advisory Committee, and chairing of our Implementation Science Working Group, Gary retired as Deputy Chief Scientist of Natural England a few years ago. And he, somewhat in jest, I hope, commented to me a few weeks ago that he had somehow managed to replace a full-time paid job at Natural England with a full-time unpaid work with the IES. After Gary, we'll pass over to Julie Hill, MBE, who is a visiting professor at UCL and Surrey, and a board member of the Office for Environmental Protection. And she's also president of the Institution of Environmental Sciences and is currently working on a project for us exploring governance in the environment sector. So firstly, over to you, Gary.
Thanks, Adam, and thanks, Liz, for organising today's event. I will start by offering a possible apology, as we have some flooring being done in the house at the moment, so you may hear some clattering, but hopefully that will be fine. Yeah, so real pleasure to be with you today, talking through the British Science Week and working with the Science Council as well. In a previous life, I was the government official responsible for sponsoring what was then called National Science Week, as I was the head of the public engagement with science team within the old Department for Trade and Industry, and I am a chartered scientist, so a living proof that chartered scientists are indeed alive and thriving. So we're going to talk today about interdisciplinarity and how it plays into sustainability, and not just plays into, but is absolutely essential for. I'm going to give a kind of bit of a conceptual, I won't call it theoretical, but conceptual kind of overview, and then Julie's going to jump in with some actual real examples of what she's up to within the OEP, subject to embargoes and various other confidentiality kind of issues. So if we could move to the next slide, please. So we've covered who we are. I think what we're going to do, just move on to the next slide, please. I think would be really helpful, is talk about how necessary interdisciplinary working is in dealing with sustainability issues. Some thinking about it in a fairly practical way, and some kind of hints and tips for working in interdisciplinary ways. There isn't a guidebook to read and work your way through. There isn't a course you can take on how to be interdisciplinary and you come out, with a stamp. It's a kind of practice, and this notion of practice is really important. And that's where we want to move on then to think about how might we develop our practice in interdisciplinary working, and then jump into Julie's part about that in action view from the OEP. To the next slide, please. So here are kind of a few metaphors really that kind of help to get a sense of interdisciplinarity. The first is a fairly famous quote now from Gary Brewer back in 1999, that the real world has problems, but universities have departments. And I spend a lot of my time working in universities, but working within centres in universities that are attempting to overcome these departmental silos. And the second is this kind of notion of wicked problems, and sustainability is nothing but wicked problem after wicked problem. And the idea of wicked problems are that they're really difficult to pin down. It's difficult to ask the question. It's difficult to kind of predict an answer, and it's very difficult to come up with an answer. So often the problems kind of persist and they pervade. But there are approaches described here, for instance, by Nancy Roberts, about taming wicked problems. And one approach to responding to those is given by an IES Burntwood lecture, previous Burntwood lecturer, Steve Rayner, who's no longer sadly with us, who talked about messy problems and clumsy solutions for those. And the pictorial kind of metaphors are quite apt as well. I did a project many years ago where I thought it was going to be about untangling a plate of spaghetti, but as a senior civil servant pointed out to me, it wasn't really about that. It was about trying to unscramble an omelette. So that's kind of some of the issues that we face working, particularly in the policy world in relation to sustainability. Next slide, please. So if we're going to work with lots of different disciplines in order to get lots of different perspectives on a particular issue, you kind of have to pick your prefix. We've focused this on interdisciplinarity, but as you can see here, there are different disciplinarities, if you like, and in fact this list goes on. There's even more disciplinarities. The important thing is the pink box at the bottom, and none is inherently right or wrong or better or worse, but you do have to know what you're working with and why it's the most suitable approach. So starting on the left-hand side, you kind of got this idea of monodisciplinarity. So if you imagine each of those colors represents a discipline, and we can call, one from the social sciences, one from engineering, and one from natural science, for instance. And each one of those disciplines basically looks at a particular issue within its box and presents its particular view forward. That's what kind of monodisciplinary. So, an ecologist, for instance, would give their view. A social scientist would give their view, and a civil engineer might give their particular view. So you can move along to think about this in a multidisciplinary way, which is where there is one box, but there are still three separate blobs, and each of those disciplines is giving its view, but it's giving its view towards somebody else who is at the recipient end of those pointy bits of those arrows. And in previous lives, I've spent many hours being the person for whom the single discipline insights have been coming, and them saying to me, right, now you've got to integrate this all, you've got to make this sing. Now that's helpful, I think, in some situations, but often it misses out on some of the joys and benefits of greater integration. So that's when we move over more towards the right-hand side. We get into this notion of interdisciplinarity, which is where there is interaction between those disciplines. And through that process of interaction, they generate a kind of new knowledge, new insights, and new methods that can generate some knowledge that would not otherwise have arisen. And that is often where the kind of real magic happens, and doesn't rely on that poor individual at the end of those arrows having to pull it all together themselves. On the right-hand side, the box itself becomes more porous. If you imagine that box to be academia or a consulting company or a business, then what they're doing there is they're allowing views to filter out and to filter in from outside. So transdisciplinarity involves the interaction between the disciplines, but with voices coming from outside as well. As I said, there are other prefixes are available, but we're going to kind of keep ourselves focused more towards this right-hand side, inter and transdisciplinary. Next slide, please. So there's been many different attempts, and no settlement on a definition of interdisciplinary research. This is coming from the Research Excellence Framework back in 2021, where I served on the Geography and Environmental Studies panel. And there was a very strong desire within that cycle of the Research Excellence Framework, which, for those who don't know, is a kind of every 7 or 8 years, the academic world goes through paroxysms of navel gazing and self-flagellation to basically assess how great it is. And they set up these panels, and I was on a panel looking at geography and environmental studies, and recognized that interdisciplinarity was growing as a feature within the research landscape, and this definition was adopted for that process. So it's achieving outcomes, including new approaches that could not be achieved within the framework of a single discipline, that it features in significant interaction between two or more disciplines, and or moves beyond established disciplinary foundations in applying or integrating research approaches from other disciplines. So as we've said before, it's kind of acting in an interdisciplinary way achieves things that would not be otherwise achieved if you just worked on a single discipline kind of basis. Next slide, please. So to be a worker in interdisciplinary space, what might that look like? And Adam mentioned in his introduction the importance of competency frameworks. So this competency kind of idea is this combination of knowledge, i.e. the facts you have about a particular issue, the skills or capabilities you have to be able to do things differently, but also attitudes and values, the kind of attributes you have as a person and behaviors you exhibit. And I put this slide together a few years ago for a workshop I was involved with the Natural Environment Research Council, looking at knowledge exchange and knowledge brokering. And as it says there in the subheading for the slide, note the relative lengths of these lists. I won't go through the list. You can read that for yourself. But again, as you can imagine, this is itself a rather curtailed sort of version. But the relative size of those lists kind of really pins down, for me at least, the idea that to be a competent interdisciplinary worker, it is more about your state of mind than the knowledge and the skills you possess. Yes, you need to know about disciplines, and you need to know about concepts and theories and methods and standards within particular different disciplines, and which disciplines are necessary to address what you're dealing with. And you need to be able to communicate and seek out links, etc. But a lot of it is about how you're working. It's about being tolerant of ambiguity, which I know for a lot of scientists is really, really difficult, because they're kind of trained to kind of eliminate ambiguity and uncertainty. That's the kind of raison d'etre of scientists. So it's about being open to ideas coming from other disciplines and recognizing that other disciplines have something valuable to offer. And indeed, if you're talking about transdisciplinary approaches, then forms of knowledge and insight outside of traditional science are also valuable and necessary if you're dealing with it in that sense. So really kind of thinking about interdisciplinarity as a state of mind, as well as a bunch of knowledge and skills you might have. So next slide, please. So we're kind of thinking then about this idea of interdisciplinary working as a practice. And I think there are 4 necessary conditions that emerge from my experience working in interdisciplinary fields, both in academia and in the public sector, and indeed in the private sector when I was an environmental consultant. That was a very, very long time ago. And the first is intention. You have to start with a very strong intention to work in this way. It doesn't kind of happen by itself. It doesn't, you kind of need to want to make it happen. So you kind of need strong and explicit objectives to work across those boundaries, make active decisions to draw in and draw together those different disciplines and different insights, and really kind of, embark upon this exercise with a strong motivation to kind of focus on the problems and recognize that no discipline has the monopoly of wisdom. The second is this notion of creating the right context for crossing these boundaries, for creating the settings. Adam mentioned that I chair the IES's External Policy Advisory Committee, and we set out to make sure that the membership of that committee is very diverse in terms of both disciplines and other protected characteristics, that it spans a lot of different areas of interest across the remit of the IES, which itself is enormously broad, and also has membership from both within the IES, but also from outside as well, with some specific expertises that we don't necessarily hold too closely within the IES membership. And Adam also left off from my list of things, because I do so many things, is I'm also a member of the College of Experts for the Office of Environmental Protection, which Julie is going to talk about shortly. And again, that college was assembled most deliberately by the chief scientist at the OEP, Robbie, as a broadly based pool of topic specialists to draw on expertise and experience necessary. So you've got to create the right settings. As I say, it doesn't happen by itself, so you need to make it happen. Next slide, please. So the third is, okay, so you've got the intention for it and you've got the setting for it, but then how do you move it forward? And very clearly, what matters is what question you ask. So given what we said about the value of interdisciplinarity in delivering insights that wouldn't be achieved by single disciplines or single institutions, you've got to kind of ask the right questions. The government's environmental improvement plan, for instance, sets out many, many different goals, but the inherent complexity of the drivers of change and how they give rise to the pressures on the environment and the effects it's having kind of requires you to have a systemic approach. You could make progress by pursuing the goals separately, but you will not get that far, and they'll often kind of fall over and end up being counterproductive, because it just creates clash and conflict. So asking the right questions is absolutely central. And then underpinning all of this is the people, that fundamentally research and whether interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity is all about the people, recognizing people as individuals with their own kind of bundles of capabilities and ways of thinking, knowledge and that things, but also thinking about the groups and the group dynamics and the networks that they're working in. Really kind of making sure that you open up dialogue to the group, and you keep that kind of open dialogue going, making sure that those intentions of ways of working and the scopes of work involved in projects are sort of subject to this openness and dialogue. And it takes time and space to do this, and this is something that's often difficult to achieve, particularly in our rushed world, and everything's constrained and pinned down. But for interdisciplinarity to really work, you've got to give people the time and space to do this. And it's not enough to just ask individual disciplines to come up with a particular view, because you end up being in that mono or multidisciplinary space again. So the interdisciplinarity absolutely requires time and space, and then underpin that by a strong leadership and management capability within the groups that are convening these kind of activities, either chairing panels or offering secretariat support. And there I absolutely have to, with my IES EPAC hat on, absolutely tip that hat towards the IES office and the support that I have as chair for that in order to work well. So next slide, please. So that's it. So that's it from me. Happy to pass straight on to Julie. Adam, did you want me to field any questions now, or just go straight on to Julie? Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Gary, thank you very much indeed. And I want to start by saying I'm indebted to Gary a great deal for expanding my thinking on how interdisciplinary practice should work. I'll also add that he was my predecessor as chair of IDS, so I'm indebted to him for support on that front as well. Okay, so a little bit about how some of this works with OEP. So if I could have the next slide, please, Liz. So just the sort of basics of OEP, Office for Environmental Protection. So we were established by the Environment Act 2021 as a new public body. We became necessary because, having left the European Union, recourse to justice on breaches by public bodies would have been through the European Commission and then the European Court of Justice. So having left the EU, there was a governance gap. So we were established with the principal objective, as I think we all do, to contribute to environmental protection, but our specific role is to hold government and other public authorities to account. So not industry, not companies, not individuals, but specifically public bodies. And that includes, of course, all government departments and their agencies and local authorities as well. Our remit covers just England and Northern Ireland and some UK reserved matters. Scotland and Wales have their own bodies, and we work with them on occasion on things of broad UK relevance. And importantly, we are one of a number of pillars of what we see as a new system of environmental governance set up by the Environment Act. And the other pillars include the Environmental Improvement Plan, which Gary just mentioned, and I'm going to say quite a lot about that as an example of interdisciplinary practice, but also a very important way of holding government to account, but also the targets that are on the face of the Act and the environmental principles, which again are designed to try and get interdisciplinary thinking across the different government departments. We're sponsored by DEFRA in the sense that our funding comes through them, but we are independent from them. Next slide, please. And so our main four functions are these, again, starting with the scrutiny of environmental improvement plans, which I'll come back to. We also have a major role scrutinising environmental law. We want to see better environmental law better implemented. That's our overall goal there. We can advise government on changes to environmental law and, in fact, other matters related to improvement. And the part of what we do that you may have seen most on so far is our enforcement function. So we can in the last resort, end up in court with public authorities. We very much aim to resolve things before it gets to that stage, but we investigate suspected failures to comply with environmental law by public authorities. And if I could have the next slide, please, I'll just say a little bit about recent investigations. We always start with an investigation approach. So ones that have had considerable amount of publicity are the ones around failures to comply with laws on discharge from combined sewer overflows, so sewage into rivers. We also looked at the possible unlawfulness of continuing to grant authorizations to neonicotinoid pesticides, which had been banned elsewhere. We're still waiting outcomes on that. In Northern Ireland, where there is a large amount of issues with livestock facilities and ammonia, we investigated the fact that some of the guidance was unlawful. That issue has now been resolved in that the guidance has been changed. And we're currently in the middle of an investigation on the fact the government has missed statutory targets to ensure marine good environmental status. So that gives you just a little bit of a sense of the range of things that are involved for us to cover and the interdisciplinary knowledge that is required to look at all of those. Next slide, please, Liz. So I'll say rather more about this major function of monitoring the environmental improvement plan, because that is where we have to bring real interdisciplinary skills to our analysis and to our publications. So what is this thing? Well, this thing called the Environmental Improvement Plan started life as a 25-year environment plan, which was first published in 2018, and this is just for England. It is quite a thing. I have always felt to have something even called a 25-year environment plan, to be looking that far ahead for a government to want to plan to improve the environment over 25 years. It's a pretty rare beast in global terms. And it's something actually this country should be very proud of to have this. It was first refreshed in 2023 and renamed as the Environmental Improvement Plan. And because of the framing in the Environment Act, these now have to happen on a cycle, and the government has to report annually on its progress, and we have to monitor that progress, and government must respond to our reports. All that is on the face of the Act. So there's a very strong governance system there for trying to ensure that this plan really does lead to meaningful change. Next slide, please. And in Northern Ireland, where we want to see a similar system evolve, there's only just been a first EIP agreed because of the suspension of government for some while. But what we did do instead, working up to that, was publish a report on underlying pressure and drivers affecting nature. Now, Gary mentioned this. One of the starting points for understanding what's going on in the environment is always to understand what it is that's causing the problems. And by pressures and drivers, we mean things like how the entire economy is working, what kind of infrastructure we're building, what kind of farming we're doing, how we're behaving as individuals in terms of our diets, a whole range of things that are going to bear on those environmental systems. And so that was quite a groundbreaking report to publish such a thing. It's really the first stage of any kind of state of the environment report, and it helps set the scene in Northern Ireland for developing a full environmental improvement plan. Next slide, please. And so when we started on this process back 4 or so years ago now, we sat back and thought, well, what would a good plan look like? It's fair enough to have a statement that there is a plan, but what are the essential components of that plan? And this formed the basis of our very first report. So again, starting with understanding the drivers and pressures, hard to decide what to do if you're not really understanding underlying causes. And then, of course, the vision, 25 years out, what is it we want to see? What do we care about? What as a society are we trying to achieve in environmental terms? That is for government to do. That's for our elected governments to do. Where do they want to be? Then there's that crucial role of setting targets. Targets drive measurement. If you can't measure, you can't manage. So having a target is an important sort of milestone, as it were, in saying where we'd like to get to. Not everything about targets might be perfect. That's a debate we're having. What's a good target? What's a less good target? But having something as an anchor is clearly very, very important. But there's no point having those targets and anchors if you then don't have a follow-up strategy and a set of policies to achieve them. So the strategies and the policies and the activities and the delivery should all follow through from those targets. They can't just, of course, do the job on their own. And to do that, you have to have appropriate governance, which really just means, in essence, does everyone know what their part is in this process, from the top of government through all the departments and agencies down to delivery on the ground? And if there's not an explicit system of governance for delivering these kinds of plans, then the chances are it won't happen. And then as the last building block, as all good scientists know, we need to follow up by trying to monitor what's actually going on. Are our targets and strategies and delivery plans actually having an effect on the ground? Can we show that? Can we measure it and report on it? So those are the essentials of forging a good plan. Next slide, please. And so what's in the plan? Just to give a sense of what it is the government is trying to achieve and how interdisciplinary that is. There are 10 goal areas overall, covering all the major sort of elements of the environment and how we care about the environment. But of course, they are massively interlinked. So, for instance, any goal that talks about using resources sustainably is somewhere probably going to have an impact on pollution and on water and on clean air. Anything that talks about adapting and mitigating to climate change is likely to have an impact on all the others. So I think we're very conscious that, of course, in order to manage anything, it has to be broken up into reasonably manageable chunks, but they are all interrelated. And so a lot of what we are doing at OEP in terms of scrutinising progress against this particular plan is trying to understand whether all the interactions are working to the maximum benefit. And while it does say there that this is a detailed delivery plan with policy actions allocated to different departments and everyone else, there are certainly elements of that, but I think our broad conclusion, having now iterated this for three times or so, is that those delivery plans are not sufficiently detailed. They're not there in all places, and the overall picture is not as good as we would want to see. Next slide, please. And we've expressed this in this one very dense picture. On the left, those are the headlines. We can see some progress, but substantial challenges. And unfortunately, the government is currently largely off track to meet its own goals and aspirations. And we've expressed this in the traffic lights. The red tells its own story, and there has been not a great deal of chance from year to year. But I just want to spend a minute unpacking what this picture means in terms of the assessment effort behind it and the interdisciplinary nature of that, because as you can imagine, our fantastic team at OEP have to do a large amount of work and bring together a huge amount of data sources, which includes government's own information from other commentators, from our College of Experts that Gary mentioned that he is part of, and piece together the past trends, where we are, how we've got to where we are, try to assess government's progress against those trends, and then in that last column, trying to look ahead, which is the most difficult bit. What are the overall prospects of meeting these ambitions and targets and commitments? And that is, as I say, an incredible bit of interdisciplinary analysis to really try and think through how all these things are operating, how they might be interacting, and come to some view of where we are on our prospects. And just as an aside, I recently had a talk at UCL, which included some colleagues at UCL who've done some very interesting work on presentation of indicators, actually on climate change indicators, so a bit different to this. and brought some neuroscience to that. And we're talking about, interestingly, how sort of the traffic light colouring, the red for danger, might not necessarily be the most motivating way of presenting this. And that's a conversation we will have inside OEP. But again, another bit of very interesting interdisciplinarity to think about the conjunction between technical information and neuroscience and how we respond to something as simple as colour. Next slide, please. And so just to sort of draw this a bit to a close, so when the new government came in, it made a commitment to reviewing the environmental improvement plan. And one of the first things we said was, well, for goodness sake, don't rip up the whole plan and start again. We don't have time for that. A huge amount of work has gone into it, and some progress is being made in some places. But what we did do, and we were asked to do, was talk about priority actions. So where we could see that there would be benefits across the EIP goals. So again, how do these systems interlink? How would we hit perhaps several goals at once? What are the main ways of the way we all currently organise our economy and our society that are relevant? And the top one is very definitely nature-friendly farming. And also further down there, talking about reconciling competing demands for land use, both land and sea, because clearly each of those, the way we use land has effect across a number of goal areas. It's clearly most relevant here to biodiversity and meeting our biodiversity goals, but also to how the water environment is working, carbon sequestration, flood alleviation. We are looking for environmental benefits and environmental gains from in a wide range of areas from the way we manage land. So nature-friendly farming and reconciling some of our competing demands, for instance, for building, for new infrastructure, for new housing, for transport, are going to be absolutely critical. Slightly differently, we know that protected sites for wildlife, so what exists in a legally protected way, are very important, but we're not making the most of those. We're not protecting them fully. We're not expanding them. We're not joining them up. So that is also a huge priority. And we also know that the marine environment, relative to everything else, has been very much neglected, and we want to see a lot of speeding up of action there. And then also on that list, and I was very pleased to see, since it's one of my specialist subjects, an emphasis from the new government on circular economy. But there's an awful lot to unpack there. The interdisciplinarity of the circular economy is enormous. It hits just about every economic system if we are to truly do that. The clue's in the word economy, in fact. So that is going to be a very interesting area to watch develop. Next slide, please. And then cross-cutting, we have some clear needs. Mobilising funding is key. It is clear that we can't necessarily expect the state, especially in present times, to be funding everything it needs to be funded, and it must be possible to bring in private investment here. We also know that regulation is crucial. There's currently a large debate about what is good regulation, what makes good regulation, including for the environment. But we know we need it, and we know we need it to be more effective. And lastly, we can't do any of this without having support from all stakeholders. And by that, I mean everyone from all the parties of government, through Parliament, through government departments, through all the pressure groups that come to bear, environment, industry, farming, all of those, and members of the public. We need to know that there is broad support. We do know that there is broad support for environmental improvement and support for the ways that we're going to go about that. And then I think I have my last slide, just to sort of summarise, I suppose, what we feel we've done with our assessment effort here. And so I very much must pay tribute to the OEP team who have done all this work. We on the board read and approve it and ask pertinent questions, but the work is done by a fantastic team. So what we're gradually developing here is increasing understanding of the drivers and pressures that we're under in this country, trying to look forward even more in terms of our information and analysis, that improved understanding of interlinkages and synergies and trade-offs, because there will have to be some, I suspect, and overall something that is more response and solution oriented. We don't want to just be the body that points out the problems. We want to be the body that points out where you can find solutions. Our job is not to make policy. It's explicitly not that we propose policy, but we can certainly highlight to government the areas where solutions might be found, and what kind of systems understanding is needed to come to the right conclusions. And so I think that's my last slide. So very many thanks, and look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Julie and Gary. So we've got about 20 minutes for questions. Some of them will come in the Q&A. I will attempt to ask all of them, but I may not ask them directly. I might try and summarize a few of them together. We should probably note that despite its importance, the IES hasn't yet cracked interdisciplinary working, although we're doing our best to get there, because the IES is divided into communities, which are special interest groups such as air quality, marine and coastal science, or land condition. And because you have these cross-cutting issues in the environment, such as PFAS or ammonia, or the impact of various industries and disciplines on the water environment. If you look at something only through one disciplinary lens, you always end up with a suboptimal solution. You have to get the right stakeholders and the right disciplines around the table if you're attempting to unscramble that spaghetti or put the eggs back in from the omelette. And so very much our new strategy at the IES that was started last year is about getting our members to work much more in an interdisciplinary fashion, get our different communities collaborating around things, and making sure that we have the right people to give us feedback. And I was very pleased in a meeting last week, feeding back on some policy that we're developing. We had a farmer, an economist, a cutting-edge researcher, and a student, which I think it almost sounds like the start of a joke, doesn't it? They all walk into a bar. But that's the types of groups that you have to get together, I think. And there are a myriad of challenges around interdisciplinary working. And you tend to find that people from different sectors tend to have quite different worldviews and priorities. And there's always a big challenge around linguistics, because all professions spring up around them this very technical language around their practice that creates a barrier for participation. I'm curious for both the speakers what you've found from your experiences to be the biggest challenges to interdisciplinary practice. Who wants to kick off with that? Gary?
Sure. Okay. Yeah, so I reflect back on the 4 necessary conditions. And I've been in situations where there's been a very strong intention, very strong motivation, but a really, really strong difficulty in setting up the settings, in creating the settings for it to happen, because that kind of requires your business processes to kind of make the space for that. And that often gets in the way hugely. So you can get the right people together with the right motivations, the right intentions, but unless you can really create the right settings in which you can then ask the right questions. So I think the questions issue is also hugely difficult, because again, the logic of the institution, the framing of an issue that an institution has kind of helps to kind of frame the questions you ask. So working in Natural England, they were very good at asking and indeed answering the questions like, how many ducks are there in the Solway Firth? But asking the question, how do we conserve ducks in the Solway Firth, was a much more difficult question, because it involves so many more different facets. And so when you have particular organizational constraints around how things get managed, how things kind of get organized, then actually finding the right settings and the right mechanisms through which to have interdisciplinarity becomes a real problem. Hence the point I made about there isn't a guidebook to follow. What I had done, though, a few years ago was to write a kind of hints and tips guide for managers in the science team in Natural England, in which most of the response that was necessary was for them as managers, not for the scientists themselves to, for the social scientists to understand ecological theory or the geoscientists who understand, social science theories. That was not where the problem was. The problem was a managerial kind of organizational and leadership one, really.
Yeah. Each year, the IS runs a conference called Dialogue Between Disciplines, which is very much focused on interdisciplinary practice. And I thought what was quite interesting in last year's conference was there wasn't a single attendee that thought that their projects wouldn't get better outcomes with more of an interdisciplinary approach. But one of the main barriers for them seems to be, who pays for it, because it tends to be quite a long and protracted process, because there's so much that kind of storming, norming, forming that has to happen at the beginning to get people working effectively. And our members are quite often under pressure to deliver things on time and within budget. And so a big question was about, who pays and how do you build this into that process? So I think there's a selling job to be done as well to convince clients and regulators and funding bodies that this is something worth pursuing, that the money spent up front gives you a better solution at the end of it. So a couple of specific questions around that is about the practice itself. Have you found that interdisciplinarity requires a lot more kind of face-to-face interactions in comparison to single disciplinary pursuits?
Very, very quickly, my immediate response to that was a comment I received from a member of the Natural England Science Advisory Committee when writing this hints and tips guide, as it were, where they absolutely reinforce the point through the phrase, interdisciplinarity is a contact sport. Now, you can make contact through the internet. We're doing that now, but I'm talking to a screen and I can see 3 other faces on it, or 2 other faces, actually. I can see my own, which is not always exciting. But short answer, yes. Physical contact, space, taking the time, getting to know each other, that kind of thing, absolutely vital.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. There's I think you do need relationships and trust, especially starting on a process. So something like delivery on the ground, for instance, of nature or water objectives. There are so many actors who could and probably should be brought to that. And personally, I think after years of meeting stakeholders and site visits, it's very good to go and see what's the issue and talk to the people who live and breathe it. That's the best kind of interdisciplinary behavior, is you're looking at the river, or you're looking at the sewage treatment plant, or you're looking at the reservoir and talking to all of those who have some expertise to bring to the problems and trying to understand how they are really approaching their job and their motivations and their ambitions for it.
Yeah, that's another key strand of work at the EIS, is looking at implementation science. So you can feel like you're designing the best policy at a national level, but actually when it comes down to the delivery on the ground, there's a lot of lessons to be learned that then need to be fed back into the policy. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Gary.
Yeah, absolutely. As I say, Adam said, I have the privilege of chairing a working group that's looking at implementation science at the moment. And one of the key insights that's emerging from that work already is, as Julie said, the vital role of vision, but shared vision. And that shared vision is developed in collaboration between different stakeholders. So again, having ways and means by which those stakeholders can get together, kind of share their kind of motivations behind things and start to work towards shared visions becomes absolutely critical. And really people understanding why they're being asked to do things. Very good examples, for instance, that coming from members of our working group working in Ireland, that the plastic bag levy in Ireland has been an absolute stonker of a success, a bit like it has in England. But and again, very clear evidence that one of the reasons for that is because people understand why, and the means of implementation are quite simple. So you get a clear understanding of why and a clear means of implementation, and then people kind of will jump at that. Other similar aspects, again, of equal importance in other aspects of environmental policy, really haven't been that successful because of a failure to establish clear vision and to have very, very complex rules behind things. I might make too much noise about BNG at this point, Biodiversity Net Gain, but you can see just how complex that is before you even get going.
Good. Someone's asked about whether conflict arises between different fields and makes interdisciplinarity difficult. I would say that conflict is inevitable when you're dealing with a wicked problem, because people have got very different ideas of what a good solution looks like. So I'm going to slightly change the question to how do you go about managing that conflict as it arises during an interdisciplinary practice? Julie, do you want to go to that one?
I'll let Gary go first on that one.
Okay. Yeah, I think Adam is absolutely right. I think conflict is inevitable because you will always have people with different views and different motivations for doing things. So yeah, transforming the question into how do you manage that conflict? I think the first thing you have to do is recognize that the conflict will be there. Say, okay, when we're running this kind of project, how are we going to deal with those? So face it very early on. Face it as an inevitability. Part of the vision, if you like, has to be how are we going to deal with conflict, because it's inevitable because of different coexisting values. The other sort of key way of dealing with it, and I wouldn't say it eliminates it, but it helps to manage it, if you like, is to get a shared insight into the evidence base of what's going on. And if you can co-design and co-produce the evidence base with a range of stakeholders, I think that is a hugely valuable thing to do. It establishes the credibility of that evidence base. It establishes the relevance of that evidence base because it speaks to what people are interested in, and it adds enormously to the legitimacy of that evidence base, so that it has a better chance of helping to resolve that. The other aspect of that is to ensure that evidence gathering process and evidence analysis and sense making process is actually part of decision making. It's not separate to it. So often people talk about we need to separate science and values. You can't do that entirely. Values go into shaping what science we do and what questions we ask. So you can't wholly separate it. But you can use the processes of evidence gathering and sense making to help you as part of governance and not separate from it.
Yeah, and equally, you can't separate science and values in terms of what you want the future to look like. So there will be different visions of the future, and I would say try and, similarly to Gary, try and concentrate on that. Where are we trying to get to? And what's the best science, what's the best interpretation of the science that will help us understand how to reach that vision.
There's a slight nuance on the question as well. It's not so much conflict, but power relationships, which can lead to conflict. And often you'll see that where engineers might look to social science to provide them with the means of communicating their solutions. That is a kind of power imbalance that says engineers kind of, have the monopoly of wisdom in terms of coming up with solutions, and then they just bring the social science in to help them communicate. That's just totally inappropriate and just is a recipe for disaster. Similarly, there can be power relationships even between disciplines within the same kind of area. So in the world of conservation, for instance, there's a definite difference between ecologists and conservation biologists. They have different views of the world, and the way to not so much worry about the conflict of that, but the fact that people could just drop past each other is again to create the time and space and create that contact sport in order for people to kind of share and say, okay, well, what are the groundings? What are the theoretical groundings of both our disciplines that we can agree on? And what are the methodological groundings that we can all agree on? And what do we think good evidence looks like, and various other things. So getting to the kind of nitty gritty and just keeping that open dialogue, I think helps to mitigate or manage conflict. Doesn't necessarily avoid it.
Yeah, from my experience as well, I think there's some good lessons from mutual gains theory where it kind of you don't jump to a conclusion too early. You don't get people to state, this is what I think the solution is. You spend a decent amount of time focusing on the problems and its dimensions, and, reserve that solution space to the very end of the process. Rather than getting someone to declare socially, what their position is very early on, and then there's a social cost to them from climbing down to that position. They'll see themselves as compromising after that, rather than working on the solution itself. And very quickly, because we're running out of time, just curious if either of you felt that there was any good technology that might support this process, if it's not possible to have that in-person meeting. One questioner is recommending open space technology as a way of managing meetings and conferences. I don't know if you've got any other
Sure.
tips or tricks around that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we talked about it, the idea early on about it really works well when you can be physically in proximity with each other, but when you can't, then you're doing things either synchronously but virtually, like we're doing now, or using online whiteboards and various other things, can be helpful and useful. And I think we've all, over the last 5 years, kind of come to recognize that, but also recognize that they are different and they can achieve different things. Often the value of the serendipitous conversation is lost because people are focused on the task that's before them, or they're just listening to something in a webinar and putting something into the chat or whatever. So they allow for different things, I think, is the problem. I thought when you mentioned tech, Adam, you were going to maybe drop AI into this. I don't think that that's particularly helpful at this stage. I think we're kind of beginning to kind of recognize more realistic options and opportunities that AI have around this.
I don't know. I would like to be able to trust AI's power of summarizing things, and if you could get it to the stage where it could sort of work through all parties' sort of statements and writings and come up with an areas of alignment, as it were, or do a job that otherwise could be done by humans but would take a very long time. Just to sort of say, look, if you look across all these stakeholder statements in the last 10 years, there are 3 areas where they clearly agree, given their positioning. So something that was able to very quickly analyze positioning to try and work out common worldviews, common suggestions, or common solutions.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not saying I couldn't do that. I'm also saying there's a whole profession of science policy folk that do this all day, every day. And they kind of, have that skill. And
I wouldn't want to put those out of work, Gary.
And you don't want to put them out of work.
Just make their lives easier, potentially.
I mean, I think there's an interesting debate here, which is to say, look, we need the time and space to make this happen. If you haven't got the time and space, what can you do? And maybe AI can be helpful in those situations. But you need to be able to trust it. And the only way you can trust it is to try and test it, which means you have to have the time and space to test it.
Yes.
You can't just rely on it and think it's a black box truth engine.
So I'm going to very smoothly segue then into the Science Council later on this week has a conversation around responsible handover of AI, where maybe they may wish to pick up on that question. I have to bring things to a close. I hope you've enjoyed today's discussion. If you have, I recommend attending the IS conference Dialogue Between Disciplines. The clue is in the title. We want lots of different disciplines present. So scientists from other fields are very welcome to that. And the whole conference is designed around how we get different disciplines working together better. So there's lessons for everyone who are not just environmental scientists. This year's event will be held in London on the 23rd of June, and details can be found on the IS website. I'd like to thank Julie and Gary for their time and the Science Council for hosting today. And just to let you know, a recording of this will go up on the Science Council YouTube channel in about a week's time. And thank you for all your questions from the attendees. I'm sorry that we couldn't have sufficient time to cover them all, but thank you for the excellent questions.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Gary. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone.
Enjoy the sun if it's shining where you are.
Yes.
It certainly is here.